You'll remember in my opening speech, I said that there were 4 facts which any adequate historical hypothesis concerning Jesus' fate must account for. First, the burial of Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea. And here Dr. Lüdemann and I basically agree on the historicity of the burial account. Whether it was Rome or the Sanhedrin who were responsible for the condemnation is a side issue. The most important thing is that the burial account is fundamentally accurate, and that means, as I said, that the site of the tomb was known in Jerusalem to Jew and Christian alike. Secondly, I argued that the empty tomb is historical, and I gave 5 lines of evidence in favor of the empty tomb. Dr. Lüdemann only responded to one of these, which was the role of the women in discovering in the empty tomb. Notice he did not deny the historicity of the women's visit to the empty tomb, but he simply tried to explain it away by saying it may not have been Jesus' tomb. Well, I was surprised to hear this. This is the old wrong tomb theory from Kearsarge Lake, which was discredited 100 years ago. The fundamental weakness in the wrong tomb theory was that even if you say the women made this mistake, the Jewish authorities could not have been guilty of any such oversight when the disciples began to preach the resurrection in Jerusalem. They would have been only too happy to point out where the body of Jesus was in fact interred, thus humiliating not only the women but the Christian disciples who were proclaiming his resurrection. So I find that to be a completely implausible hypothesis, and it's been unanimously rejected by contemporary scholarship. He then raises one objection to the empty tomb that is new. He says, well, Paul omits any mention of the empty tomb in his letters. Well, this is basically an argument from silence, and therefore I think we should always be careful about appealing to arguments from silence. It doesn't prove that Paul didn't know the fact of the empty tomb. In fact, I think when you look at 1 Corinthians 15, there's a very good reason for Paul not to mention the empty tomb. Namely, the Corinthians, as Greek thinkers, recoiled at the idea of the resurrection of the physical body. And therefore, what Paul wants to do is to convince them that the resurrection body is in some sense spiritual. It's a spiritual, supernatural body. So he doesn't want to argue for its physicality in 1 Corinthians 15, but for its spirituality. And therefore, appeal to the empty tomb would be completely beside the point. There's no reason to mention it. Moreover, I think the empty tomb is implied in the formula Paul quotes. How? Well, when Paul says he was buried and he was raised, that implies an empty grave. E. Ellis, a New Testament scholar, says it's very unlikely that the earliest Palestinian Christians could conceive of any difference between resurrection and physical grave-emptying resurrection. To them, a resurrection without an empty grave would have been about as meaningless as a square circle. So in saying he was buried and he was raised, Paul implies an empty tomb was left behind. Secondly, when he says that he was raised on the 3rd day, that expression is most likely a time indicator for the date of the women's visit to the tomb, because it came by Jewish reckoning on the 3rd day after the crucifixion, and is thus an oblique reference to the empty tomb. And it's very interesting when you compare that 4-line formula in 1 Corinthians 15 to the Gospels on the one hand, and the sermons in the book of Acts on the other hand. What corresponds to the expression, he was raised, is, lo and behold, the empty tomb story. So I don't think this argument from silence is compelling. We agree, thirdly, on the resurrection appearances. Dr. Lüdemann says that these are legendary in many respects, but nothing in my case depends upon taking these accounts to be completely historically trustworthy. I'm simply arguing for the fundamental historical credibility of the fact that the disciples did have these experiences of Jesus' appearances after his death, and on that we agree. Fourth, I said the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection is something that needs to be explained. And here Dr. Lüdemann agreed that they came to believe in the resurrection, but he said this is perfectly natural to say that Jesus is still alive. But that's not what they said. They said he was risen from the dead, and that is the most unnatural thing for a Jewish believer to say, because it contradicts fundamental Jewish beliefs. There can be no resurrection prior to the end of the world in Judaism. And far from being natural, this is in fact highly unusual. N.T. Wright, a New Testament critic from Britain, points out All of the followers of those first century Messianic movements were fanatically committed to the cause. They, if anybody, might be expected to suffer from this blessed 20th century disease called cognitive dissonance when their expectations failed to materialize. But in no case, right across the century before Jesus and the century after him, do we hear of any Jewish group saying that their executed leader had been raised from the dead and that he was really the Messiah after all. This was utterly un-Jewish. And the resurrection is something that cries out for explanation. You can't say they were simply saying he was still alive. Dr. Lüdemann says, well, the belief in Jesus' exaltation was prior to belief in his resurrection. I don't think so at all. Remember, we saw in 1 Corinthians 15, and we saw in Mark's source extremely early evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb, which shows that belief in Jesus' resurrection was just as early as belief in his exaltation. So these are the facts. The question is, how do you best explain them? I think the resurrection hypothesis explains all of these facts well. By contrast, I don't think Dr. Lüdemann's hallucination hypothesis is a good explanation. And I'd like to now briefly look at that account by using those same 6 criteria suggested by C.B. McCullough. First, explanatory scope. I think this is the real Achilles heel of the hallucination hypothesis. It tries to explain the appearances, but it says absolutely nothing about the empty tomb. And therefore, in order to explain that, you need to conjoin an independent hypothesis to the hallucination hypothesis. It thus has an explanatory scope which is too narrow to be the best explanation. Second, what about explanatory power? Does it even explain the appearances well? Let's imagine that Peter did have a guilt complex, and he was one of those rare persons who see a vision of a deceased loved one. Does that hypothesis explain the resurrection appearances and the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection? Well, I don't think so for 2 reasons. First of all, the diversity of the appearances can't be explained in this way. Jesus didn't appear just one time to Peter, but to many different individuals and persons, not just on one occasion, but on different occasions. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people, not just at one locale and circumstance, but at various locales and circumstances. Not just to believers, but even to unbelievers and enemies, like James, for example. How do you account for James' vision of Jesus when he wasn't even a believer in Jesus? Or the 500 brethren? Or the women who saw Jesus prior to his appearance to Peter, and therefore cannot be explained away as a result of contagion based on Peter's experience. So the diversity of the appearances can't be plausibly explained by hallucinations. Secondly, hallucinations fail to explain why the disciples came to believe in Jesus' resurrection. You see, as projections of the mind, hallucinations don't contain anything not already in the mind. And given their typical Jewish frame of thought, if the disciples were to hallucinate Jesus, they would project visions of him in Abraham's bosom in glory. And that would at most have led to belief in the glorification or assumption of Jesus into heaven, not his literal resurrection from the dead, which is, as I explained, a belief that goes right back to the earliest times of the Jesus movement. So in terms of both, its inability to explain the diversity of the appearances and the origin of the disciples' faith, I think that the hallucination hypothesis has weak explanatory power. What about plausibility? Let me mention 2 reasons why I think the theory has little plausibility. First, its psychoanalysis of Peter and Paul, I think, has little plausibility. Dr. Lüdemann's use of depth psychology depends upon certain theories of Carl Jung, and these are highly disputed. So his theory cannot have any more plausibility than these theories themselves, which are already very implausible and controverted. But secondly, there's just insufficient data to do a psychoanalysis of Peter and Paul. Psychoanalysis is difficult to do with somebody seated in front of you on the couch, much less historical figures. And that's why psychobiology